Okay, so welcome. Can you see the screen? Yeah.
Yes, sir. What
Okay.
are you saying? I didn't listen.
You can see this objections to
Yes,
astrology.
yes, sir. Of course, sir. We can see easily.
Okay, great. So, welcome HUL256 lecture number 19. Today is the last day we'll be looking at the section on science. We were supposed to have a guest lecture on thinking about data today, but that's been postponed a week from today to next Thursday. And on Saturday, we have an extra class where I'll introduce the theme of the last few weeks of the semester, which is um, thinking about data. I'll just post the readings later today, and the thing we'll be looking at then is maybe I'll stop the recording for a second, stop sharing for a second. Can you see me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so we'll be looking at this book. I don't know if you come across this book called Calling Bullshit, The Art of Skepticism in a Data-Driven World. We'll look at a couple of chapters of this book. So we'll get started on that, like I said, on Saturday, and then the last 2 weeks we'll look at that in the lectures, and then in the tutorials we will look at some of Kahneman's work from his book Thinking Fast and Slow. And of course, there's also this tutorial on Saturday, which is 4 o'clock, where we look at that reading by Appia that I posted, and I apologize I didn't post before. So with that said, let me go back to sharing the screen and talk about objections to astrology. And this is one of the documents that HUL256 is responding to in this I guess very old paper from just around the time I was born on astrology and pseudoscience. And I like the paper for a bunch of different reasons, which I'll mention as I go along. But again, to remind ourselves that we care about these issues in the context of a course on critical thinking, because we think of, or it's often thought, that scientific activity per se is a high point of the exercise of our rational intellectual powers, which we're also supposed to exercise in the course of thinking critically. So Thagard's main point, I think I would say he has two sorts of aims in this paper. And one aim, this is kind of important to note, right? He thinks, if you look at the title of the paper, he thinks that astrology is a pseudoscience, and to that extent, he also has objections to astrology. But really, the first 5 or 6 pages of the paper, he starts talking about, what he brief intellectual kind of account of historical account of astrology, and then you see he moves now to this, amongst others, this statement, the statement that I just showed. And he says the statement raises 3 main issues we'll talk about. None of these objections is ground for condemning astrology as pseudoscience. So one way of framing this is, look, he agrees with the conclusions of the people who frame this letter, these various scientists, but he disagrees with their reasoning that leads them to this conclusion. And the first chunk of the paper, really from page 29 to about 32 or 33, 31. He essentially goes through the criteria they suggest, or the reasons that they give for saying that astrology is a science, and he says, look, these reasons are not good reasons. Either they have problems of their own, they're not in general good grounds for solving the demarcation problem, or in fact, even if they are okay in some cases, astrology actually satisfies these criterion. So again, he's agreeing with the conclusion of these scientists, but he's saying, I disagree with the reasoning that goes to your, that takes you to this conclusion, and I'm going to get to my conclusion via an alternative kind of reasoning, which then he sketches out in the rest of the paper. Why do I point out this big picture fact? You know, you might think if one's aim is to show something, show that X, show that astrology is a pseudoscience, show that, I don't know, somebody is guilty of a crime, etc., etc. You know, why pick fights with people who are basically on your own side? Right? There's one, certainly in politics, sometimes people have that kind of idea. You know, when you have a coalition for some particular aim, let's agree not to talk about things that divide us internally. Let's focus on the main goal, and it's maybe that's legitimate in various forms of human activity, but I think the suggestion is that in the case of critical thinking, at least, that's not our goal. And our goal is not first and foremost to win a debate or to convince people to believe what one thinks, but to investigate, to ask what are the good reasons for believing certain things. And often the enemies of critical thought are strongest when we're talking about things that we basically agree with, or people who are on our side. But if you have a belief in some political or religious or whatever dispute, and you have somebody who's very motivated and bright kind of on the other side, then in any case, who's trying to convince you of something you don't agree with, in a way you're already primed to be a critical thinker, to at least in some respects, to be sharp and analytical. But and that's the metaphor of critical thinking as intellectual self-defense. But in fact, the temptations to think uncritically may be greatest with respect to statements you already believe in. And I think one of the things that's nice about Thagad's paper is that it it shows you one model for thinking critically, philosophy in general, as an exercise in critical thinking, where you critically examine what problems there may be in theories that or in arguments that lead to conclusions that you yourself believe in. And another kind of useful big picture thought is that he's criticizing. So this statement is made by a bunch of leading scientists, including various Nobel Prize winners, and one might have this thought that, look, what does a philosopher have to say about science to a whole bunch of scientists? And I think it's important to see that. I think we've talked about this earlier in the course, that one should be careful of arguments from authority when exercised by scientists themselves. we had a discussion, I remember, on authority versus expertise. I can't remember when that discussion happened. But you might think, look, scientists are experts in the field of their own domain. So, a physicist is an expert in their particular field of physics. But scientists need not be experts in this kind of meta question, this meta theoretical question about what it is for an activity to be scientific activity. What is it for an activity to be a pseudoscientific activity? That may be more a domain of, let's say, the philosopher of science. And so it's important to see that Taggart's criticism, he's not fazed by the fact that these are leading scientists who are talking about these issues, because after all, they're not talking about areas where they are necessarily experts. This is a more general question. It's not necessarily the domain only of people who have a PhD in philosophy. I mean, I think after this segment of the course, you guys know more about the philosophy of science than most people, even though you are, I imagine, not training to be philosophers of science. But it's so, again, just to bring this back, you might think, look, this is also an exercise in critical thinking, this piece, and in fact he's thinking critically about, amongst other things, a statement by 186 leading scientists who, in a way, are themselves, they're speaking in the language of thinking critically, right? They're speaking in the language of science, no verified scientific basis for their belief, in the language of evidence, and so forth. So those are the two big picture framing points I wanted to make before we get into the details of the article. Right. So one framing point being critical thinking as sometimes or often being deployed or deployable on your own beliefs or on quote unquote your own side, and maybe the critical thinker at some level shouldn't take sides, because I think this is something that, again, either Mukul, I think Mukul, like early on in the course, formulated quite nicely about, is this a process thing or is this a substance thing? Do you remember that, Mukul? Was it you? Or maybe it was I can't remember who it was.
I'm not sure if it was me.
Whether critical thinking is, whether it's about, okay, look, the process of how somebody reaches a particular conclusion, or whether it's about the conclusion itself.
Yeah, I think it was me. Yes.
This is in the context of discussions of politics. Let's say that is what we were talking about in the first half of the course. So anyway, so that is the first big picture point, and the second big picture point, just talking about who is an authority versus who is an expert. And here the scientists are being treated in a way, they're certainly not being treated as authorities, but in fact they're not being treated as experts either. Or one might say that the reasons that they're giving for claiming that astrology is a pseudoscience, Taggart says, don't hold. And before we get into the details, any questions that questions or thoughts that you had about the paper in general, or on what I've just said, before we get into the details? Okay, fine. So what I'm going to do is, what I want to do is really do three things. The first thing, just walk us through what his problem is with the scientists who have objections to astrology and call it pseudoscientific. So that's the negative kind of claim. Second, walk us through Thagard's positive theory, which he articulates later on in the paper. I think it's on page 33 here, 32. So I want to discuss his own theory, or his own account, and what its implications are. And then finally, I want to discuss one more kind of big picture question which arises from the particular theory that he gives, the details of his own account of demarcation, which has to do with, in our context, in the context of critical thinking, the role of a community as opposed to an individual as the locus for critical thinking. And I've mentioned that before, but it's an important thing to point out. Okay, so I am going to now get to the text itself. Why don't we have somebody read this paragraph? Well, from here to Hemant, go ahead. The statement raises.
The statement raises three main issues. Astrology originated as part of a magical worldview. The planets are too distant for there to be any physical foundation for astrology, and people believe it merely out of longing for comfort. None of these objections is ground for condemning astrology as pseudoscience. To show this, I shall briefly discuss articles written by Bock and Jerome in support of the statement. According to Bock, to work on statistical tests of astrological predictions is a waste of time unless it is demonstrated that astrology has some sort of physical foundation. He uses the smallness of gravitational and radiative effects of the stars and planets to suggest that there is no such foundation. He also discusses the psychology of belief in astrology, which is the result of individuals' desperation in seeking solutions to their serious personal problems. Jerome devotes most of his article to the origins of astrology in the magical principle of correspondence. He claims that astrology is a system of magic rather than science, and that it fails not because of any inherent inaccuracies due to precision or lack of exact knowledge concerning time of birth or conception, but rather because its interpretations and predictions are grounded in the unseen's magical worldview. He does, however, discuss some statistical states of astrology, which I shall return to below.
Okay, please pause. Hang on. So let's just think, since you've all read, or I'm going to take it as a given that you've read the piece, let's just think about the statement, the sentence I've highlighted, these 3 points, that it originated as part of a magical worldview, that there's no physical foundation, and that people believe it merely out of longing for comfort. And if you look at the statement itself, you can see that these elements are there. Right? So this is the statement that talks about the origins of astrology are in people's magical worldview. Now you can say that it's a mistake to imagine that. Well, here he's claiming that there is no physical foundation. The statement is claiming that, and then there is a kind of diagnosis of many long for the comfort of having guidance in making decisions. That's is where these 3 things appear. So what is, rather than going through the article itself, what is Thagard's problem with the claim that the reason that astrology is a pseudoscience is that it originates in a magical worldview? Like, it's nice maybe to go here, because astrology. So the scientists are saying, look, this is why, and they don't use the term pseudoscience, but this is why we shouldn't believe in astrology. we shouldn't believe in astrology because it had its origins in a magical worldview. What is Thagad's problem with this line of criticism of? Sorry, I'm just going to move my desktop a bit. What does Thagard think is wrong with that line of reasoning? And if you've not read Thagard's piece or you don't remember it, what do you think might be a problem saying, hey, this is not scientific because it originated as part of a magical worldview? If you can't think of that, then I invite you to spend a few minutes and read that part of the Thagard text. Or maybe we should do that in any case. Why don't we take 5 minutes and just read page 29 through maybe the end of this paragraph on page 30. Yeah, so it's 5:29 right now. I'm going to switch off my video. Let's wait for 5 or 6 minutes and take a look at what he says, and then let's come back and talk about it.